Conspiracy theories are often dismissed as lies or paranoia, but sometimes the truth hides in plain sight, far darker than anyone could imagine. In this video, we'll look at 5 real stories where shocking conspiracies turned out to be true. From secret experiments and hidden agendas to government cover-ups, these cases prove that sometimes the theories aren't theories at all. It was 1932 in Macon County, Alabama, a poor farming area in the Deep South. A group of men stood outside a small hospital near the Tuskegee Institute. They were mostly African-American sharecroppers, struggling to survive the Great Depression. Government doctors told them they could get free medical care, meals, and even money for their funerals if they joined a study for something called bad blood. What they didn't know was that this promise would lead to one of the most disturbing medical betrayals in American history. This became known as the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis, later called simply the Tuskegee Experiment. It lasted not for months or years, but for 40 years. The study was organized by the U.S. Public Health Service with help from the Centers for Disease Control and the Tuskegee Institute, a respected black college. The official purpose was to study how a certain infection affected African American men. But the true goal was far darker, to see what would happen if the disease was left untreated. About 600 men were enrolled. Of them, 399 had the infection, and 201 did not. They were told they'd receive care, food, and burial coverage. In reality, they were being used for observation. Doctors told them they had bad blood, a term locals used for many illnesses. None of the men were told they had a serious infection that could cause blindness, paralysis, or even death without treatment. The study was meant to last 6 months, but it continued for 4 decades. Early treatments were risky, involving chemicals like mercury and arsenic. Even so, these could help. But the researchers had no interest in curing the men. They wanted to watch the disease's progress. When penicillin became the standard cure in 1945, the doctors still refused to give it. They even stopped the men from getting treated elsewhere. During World War II, hundreds of infected participants tried to enlist, but military doctors were blocked from treating them because the Tuskegee researchers said the study had to continue. The men received fake treatments, pills, ointments, and painful spinal taps disguised as medical care. Many later suffered blindness, heart failure, or severe mental decline. The project was started by Taliaferro Clark and continued by officials like Raymond Vonderlehr and John Heller. They justified it as important for science. One nurse, Eunice Rivers, worked with the men for all 40 years. She cared for them deeply but still followed orders that kept the truth hidden. By the 1960s, some doctors inside the Public Health Service began to question the ethics, but their warnings were ignored. In 1966, investigator Peter Buxton discovered the study and reported it. When nothing changed, he leaked the story to the press. On July 25, 1972, the first article appeared. The next day, it hit the New York Times. Public outrage was immediate. Investigations revealed that dozens of men had died, many wives had been infected, and children were born with the disease. The study was shut down that November. A lawsuit followed, and in 1974, the government paid $10 million and promised lifelong medical care for survivors and their families. In 1997, President Bill Clinton apologized to the remaining survivors at the White House. His words finally acknowledged their suffering. What the United States government did was shameful, and I am sorry. The Tuskegee experiment remains one of the darkest examples of government deception. For 40 years, these men were told they were being helped, but they were being watched as their health and trust faded away. And that's what makes the Tuskegee study one of the most haunting true stories in American history. It was November 28, 1953, just after 2 a.m. in New York City. A man's body was found on the sidewalk outside the Statler Hotel. His name was Frank Rudolph Emanuel Olson, a 43-year-old scientist who worked for the United States Army Biological Warfare Laboratories at Camp Detrick, Maryland. The official report said he fell from the 10th floor window of his hotel room. Police ruled it an apparent self-inflicted death. But what looked simple at first was far from it. Frank Olson's case would later become linked to one of the most secretive CIA projects in history, Project MKUltra. Frank was born on July 17, 1910, in Hurley, Wisconsin. The son of Swedish immigrants, he was intelligent and curious. He earned both his bachelor's and PhD in bacteriology from the University of Wisconsin, where he met his wife, Alice. They had 3 children together. After a short teaching job at Purdue University, Frank joined the U.S. Army Chemical Corps during World War II and was stationed at Fort Hood, Texas. His former professor, Ira Baldwin, invited him to work on a secret project developing biological weapons. Frank accepted and was soon transferred to Camp Detrick, which became the center of the U.S. biological warfare program. By 1943, Frank was deeply involved in experiments testing toxins and microorganisms. After the war, he continued at Detrick as a civilian scientist. He joined Operation Harness in 1949 and later Operation Sea Spray, where bacteria were released over San Francisco to study public exposure. He also worked at Fort Terry on Plum Island, where tests too dangerous for the mainland took place. When tensions with the Soviet Union increased, the military created the Special Operations Division, or SOD, focusing on biological and chemical weapons. Frank became its acting chief and began working with the CIA on Project Artichoke, which tested interrogation methods using substances and psychological manipulation. By the early 1950s, Frank's work began to weigh heavily on him. He had witnessed animal deaths and intense interrogations overseas. His son, Eric Olson, later said his father seemed disturbed and withdrawn. In 1953, Frank stepped down from his leadership role, struggling with stress and moral doubt. That November, he attended a CIA retreat at Deep Creek Lake, Maryland, along with several scientists and CIA officers, including Sidney Gottlieb and Robert Lashbrook. During the meeting, Gottlieb secretly put LSD, a powerful hallucinogenic, into their drinks. None of them, including Frank, knew. The next morning, Frank appeared deeply shaken. Back home, he told his wife, "I've made a terrible mistake." He couldn't eat or sleep and told colleagues he felt all mixed up. His supervisor, Lieutenant Colonel Vincent Ruett, decided he needed help. On November 24th, Ruett and Lashbrook took Frank to New York to see Dr. Harold Abramson, a doctor tied to the CIA. Abramson suggested Frank stay in the city for observation. He and Lashbrook checked into room 1018A at the Statler Hotel. Witnesses said Frank looked terrified. Around 2 a.m. on November 28th, Frank fell through the closed window of his 10th floor room. He died shortly after hitting the sidewalk. Lashbrook was found calmly sitting in the room when police arrived. When the phone rang, an operator overheard him say, "Well, he's gone," to which the other voice replied, "That's too bad." The case was ruled a self-inflicted death, but years later the truth began to unravel. In 1975, government reports revealed the CIA had secretly administered LSD to people under Project MKUltra, including Frank. The Olson family received an apology from President Gerald Ford and CIA Director William Colby, along with $750,000 in compensation. But Eric Olson believed his father was silenced. In 1994, a second autopsy found injuries suggesting Frank had been hurt before his fall. Forensic experts said the wounds were more consistent with foul play. Despite congressional hearings and new evidence, no further investigation was launched. Many believed Frank knew too much about the CIA's secret programs and was seen as a risk. When MKUltra's files surfaced, they revealed over 149 sub-projects involving experiments with various substances, hypnosis, and psychological control. Most records had been destroyed in 1973. Decades later, the mystery remains. Some believe Frank's death was a tragic breakdown. Others say it was a cover-up. Whatever the truth, Frank Olson's story exposed one of the darkest government programs ever created, one that blurred the line between science and human morality. It was the early 1950s, less than 10 years after the atomic bombings that changed the world forever. The fear of radiation was spreading fast, and no one fully understood what nuclear fallout could do to the human body over time. Governments kept testing bombs, chasing knowledge, and that search would lead to one of the darkest scientific scandals ever uncovered. This is the story of Project Sunshine, a government research effort that began as a study to protect people, but crossed one of the deepest moral lines in history. In 1953, the United States Atomic Energy Commission and the U.S. Air Force's Project RAND started Project Sunshine. On paper, it was meant to study how radioactive fallout spread around the planet after nuclear tests. Scientists knew that when bombs exploded, they released dangerous particles into the air that later contaminated the ground, food, and water. But they didn't know how deeply that radiation entered human bodies. One isotope worried them the most, strontium-90. It behaved like calcium, settling in human bones and staying there. It was especially dangerous for children whose growing bones absorbed it more easily. By 1955, scientists wanted more data, real human data. To know how much strontium-90 had entered the population, they needed bone samples. And that's where the project took a dark turn. On January 18, 1955, at an Atomic Energy Commission meeting, scientist Dr. Willard Libby said something that would later horrify the world. He stated that human samples were vital and even joked about needing people skilled in body snatching. It wasn't a joke. He meant they needed actual human remains, especially from infants and children. What followed was a secret international operation to collect over 1,500 cadavers, most taken without family consent. Scientists quietly gathered remains from hospitals and morgues across the US, the UK, Australia, and Europe. In 1957, a British mother named Jean Prichard lost her stillborn daughter. When she asked to dress her baby for burial, she was denied. Decades later, she discovered her daughter's legs had been secretly removed and sent to America for research. She had lived nearly 40 years without knowing the truth. Thousands of other families across several countries shared similar experiences. Their loved ones' remains had been used for radiation research without their knowledge. The collected samples were tested in U.S. labs to measure strontium-90 levels, though only about 500 were fully analyzed. By 1958, the testing expanded to Belgium, where researchers also studied soil, plants, and animal tissue to trace how radiation entered the food chain, especially through milk. Scientists later confirmed that strontium-90 could cause long-term harm, especially to children. For decades, Project Sunshine remained secret, buried under classified files and government protection. It wasn't until the mid-1990s that the truth surfaced. In 1995, President Bill Clinton's Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments released its findings, uncovering hidden Cold War research. Declassified files confirmed what many had suspected. Governments had taken human remains without consent in the name of science and national security. The revelation caused outrage worldwide. Families discovered that parts of their loved ones had been shipped overseas for testing. Officials defended their actions, saying it was a different time and that the studies were meant to protect humanity. But the documents showed they knew their methods were wrong even then. That same year, the U.S. government officially admitted the unethical nature of these experiments. New laws required full consent for all human research. But for many families, the damage could never be undone. Project Sunshine began as a study to understand radiation, a noble idea on paper. But behind that mission was a chilling truth. When secrecy outweighs morality, anything can be justified. The name Project Sunshine sounded bright and harmless. In reality, it was a hidden operation that took the remains of children from around the world, all in the name of science. And for decades, no one knew. Project Sunshine was real. It was dark. And it left a scar that still lingers in the history of science. It was March 8, 1971, in Media, Pennsylvania, a small town west of Philadelphia. That night, 8 people broke into a local FBI office. They called themselves the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI. Inside, they discovered hundreds of secret files that would expose one of the darkest federal operations in American history. It was known as COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program. At first, the documents seemed like normal FBI reports. But as the group read more, they realized what they had found. Proof that the FBI had secretly spied on and targeted its own citizens. The papers revealed years of hidden operations, illegal acts, and false accusations, all ordered under longtime FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. COINTELPRO began in 1956 during the Cold War. Officially, it aimed to protect national security. In reality, it was designed to control dissent within the United States. The first target was the Communist Party USA, but by the 1960s, the list had grown to include nearly every major social and political movement in the country. Civil rights groups like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the NAACP, the Black Panther Party, feminist groups, Native American activists, and anti-war organizers. Hoover saw these activists not as citizens exercising free speech, but as threats to his control. He personally ordered that they be disrupted or discredited. Agents were told to infiltrate organizations, spread rumors, forge letters, and turn members against each other. Some even provoked violence to make the groups look dangerous. Nearly 85% of COINTELPRO's resources went towards silencing civil rights, anti-war, and social justice movements. Only about 15% targeted violent hate groups. One of the program's main targets was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The FBI wiretapped his phones, bugged his hotel rooms, and tried to destroy his reputation by sending anonymous letters urging him to abandon his work. The Black Panther Party also became a top target. Though many chapters focused on feeding poor children and protecting communities, Hoover ordered them eliminated. The FBI worked with police to raid Panther offices, many of which ended violently. The most infamous case was Fred Hampton, the 21-year-old Chicago chairman. On December 4, 1969, FBI informants provided police with his apartment's layout. That night, over 90 shots were fired, and Hampton lost his life. The FBI also targeted student activists who protested the Vietnam War. Agents forged documents, spread false stories, and even created fake groups to spy on real ones. Many students lost jobs, scholarships, or homes after the FBI contacted their employers and landlords with false claims. COINTELPRO's tactics went beyond spying. They aimed to destroy lives. Activist Viola Liuzzo, killed by extremists in 1965, was smeared by the FBI afterward with false stories to protect its informants. A Senate investigation later revealed COINTELPRO's main methods: infiltration, psychological manipulation, legal harassment, and illegal force. Agents broke into homes and offices more than 200 times without warrants, stole documents, and planted bugs. Everything changed in 1971 when the Citizens Commission mailed the stolen files to reporters. While many newspapers hesitated, a few published them, exposing 15 years of government wrongdoing. Under growing outrage, Hoover ended COINTELPRO that same year. In 1976, the Senate's Church Committee condemned the FBI's actions as a vigilante operation that violated citizens' rights. The Bureau later issued a formal apology, but for many it came too late. Even decades later, evidence suggested similar surveillance continued. Records from 2008 showed that the FBI monitored journalists and activists long after COINTELPRO's closure. The 1971 break-in became one of the most important acts of whistleblowing in U.S. history. 8 ordinary citizens revealed how far their government had gone to silence dissent and how fragile freedom can become when power goes unchecked. It was March 13, 1962, in Washington, D.C. Inside the Pentagon, tension filled the air. The Cold War was at its peak, and every move between the United States and the Soviet Union felt like a spark that could ignite global conflict. In one of the Pentagon's most secure rooms, top military officials gathered around a table. At the head sat General Lyman Lemnitzer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In front of him was a document stamped Top Secret. Its title read, Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba. This plan would later be known as Operation Northwoods, one of the most shocking proposals ever created by the U.S. government. The idea was simple but deeply disturbing. The military would stage violent acts against American citizens, soldiers, and property, then blame them on Cuba. The goal was to anger the public enough to support a war against Fidel Castro. To understand how this happened, we need to go back a few years. In 1959, Fidel Castro overthrew the U.S.-backed Cuban government. At first, Americans saw him as a revolutionary hero, but when Castro aligned himself with the Soviet Union and seized American-owned businesses, the U.S. began to see Cuba as a serious threat, a communist state only 90 miles from Florida. By 1962, tensions were explosive. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion had humiliated the U.S., and military leaders wanted revenge. They needed a reason to invade Cuba, and that's where Operation Northwoods came in. The document Lemnitzer presented outlined a series of staged events designed to make Cuba look like the aggressor. These included hijacking civilian planes and making them appear to be Cuban attacks, sinking refugee boats, and even setting off explosions in American cities like Washington and Miami. Some proposals suggested fake funerals, false evidence, and staged news reports to sell the story. Every detail was planned to manipulate public opinion and justify war. The plan was not drafted by low-ranking officers. It came from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military officials in the country. The main author, Brigadier General Edward Lansdale, was already leading covert anti-Cuban operations under Operation Mongoose, a campaign aimed at removing Castro through sabotage and psychological tactics. When the document was complete, Lemnitzer signed it and sent it to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. One idea suggested staging attacks at the U.S. naval base in Guantanamo Bay and blaming Cuba. Another proposed faking the destruction of a U.S. aircraft using a drone, complete with fake distress calls and wreckage. There was even a plan known as Operation Dirty Trick that proposed blaming Cuba if astronaut John Glenn's upcoming space mission failed. When McNamara and President John F. Kennedy reviewed the proposal, they were alarmed. Kennedy immediately rejected it, stating that such pretexts were unacceptable. He soon removed Lemnitzer from his position as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, although Lemnitzer was later appointed Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. For decades, Operation Northwoods remained buried in classified archives until 1997, when it was declassified by the John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Review Board. In 2001, investigative journalist James Bamford exposed the full details in his book Body of Secrets. The revelation stunned the public. It confirmed that top U.S. officials had once considered deceiving their own citizens to start a war. Cuba's government quickly condemned the plan, calling it proof of the U.S. government's hostility and moral decay. Though Operation Northwoods was never carried out, it left behind a haunting legacy. It revealed how far powerful institutions were willing to go under the excuse of national security. If Kennedy hadn't rejected it, the world might have faced another catastrophic war, possibly even a nuclear one. Operation Northwoods remains one of the most unsettling secrets in American history, a reminder that even in a free nation, deception can grow quietly behind closed doors.